Our scripture reading today is Mark 25 through 34. Please stand if you are able. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
Well, she didn't plan on bothering Jesus. Just quietly sneaking up to his robe, just to get a touch. Her health problem seemed to have no known cure. There was no medicine that anybody knew of that would fix her. And the cultural mores and the religious rules made her an outcast on account of her persistent bleeding. Word had gotten around that Jesus could heal people, and she hoped that healing would flow out of him and into her, and that he would really never even need to know about it. She would just get healed, and that would be it. But that's not the way that it went. After she touched Jesus' clothes, Jesus spun around looking for her in the crowd and asked, "Who touched me?" Despite the fact that they were in a crowd of people, and Jesus' disciples think that it's an odd question for him to ask considering the circumstances, but Jesus knew, he felt that power, healing power, had gone out from him. And so the woman's attempt at remaining anonymous was not going to happen. Jesus looked around at the crowd, at the faces, until he saw her. And her attempt at remaining anonymous became a face-to-face encounter with Jesus. She came forward, she came to him, a little afraid, trembling, the Gospel of Mark tells us, and she fell down in front of Jesus, and she told him her whole situation. And instead of sending her away or calling her unclean like her neighbors did, instead of that, Jesus says to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." There she was, sick, desperate, living on the margins of society, excluded from the community life. And Jesus not only healed her body, but also he blessed her spirit. He blessed her life with this word of peace, and he called her daughter. That's a signal of belonging, being included, being connected, not being left out. To Jesus, she was not a faceless disease. She was not a problem to be dealt with. To Jesus, she wasn't just another face in the crowd, someone else who bumped into him. When he looked at her, he saw the face of God. He saw a reflection of his own life in her. Jesus' words and actions would restore her to relationship with community. For 12 years, it was like she'd been trapped by her disease. Her condition took away her freedom, it took away her dignity, and on the day that she touched Jesus' robe, he turned and he treated her as a human being who belonged. Today we are on the second of 5 Sundays in our series, Simple Faith, Lessons on Living from Mr. Rogers. It was the recent Tom Hanks movie, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, that prompted me to develop this series. And I'll let you know that we plan to have a movie night once the movie is released on DVD or some digital format. Thinking it's going to be mid-February, so we'll let you know as soon as we have that set. Each week during the series, we are looking at some of the simplest, most basic elements of the Christian faith and how they were taught and exhibited in the life of Fred Rogers. In conjunction with reaffirming our baptism last Sunday, we started this series with a lesson that was often repeated on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, that you are special. If you missed last Sunday, I encourage you to go on our website or to the church app to watch or listen. And I don't always put a plug in and say, hey, you got to go listen to me preach. I'm not quite that stuck on myself. But here's the thing. Of all the messages that I might preach in 52 Sundays this year, I just have a sense that this is the one that so many of us need to hear, or if you don't necessarily need to hear it for yourself, you need to know it and be reminded of it so you can offer it to somebody else. So if you missed it, go take a listen. Nakia preached on the same topic. You can listen to her sermon if you'd rather. That's fine too. We both shared that message. And that message from last week is this: you are special inside and out. You are the beautiful handiwork of God. No matter where you may have wandered, no matter what life has done to you or what you have done in life, you are God's precious, beloved child. So our second lesson on living from Mr. Rogers is to see the face of God in others, in all kinds of others. And that this second lesson today really builds on the first lesson. Because maybe you were thinking when you heard that message last Sunday, and it's been one of the criticisms of Mr. Rogers' teaching, well, if you are special, and you are special, and you are special, and you are special, everybody's special? Well, yes, that's the message. Because you are made in the image of God. And so is the person next to you. And so is the person next to them. And so is everybody else. Jesus saw the face of God, the sacredness, the humanness of every person, including, if not especially, the outcast, the marginalized, the least of these, such as the bleeding woman. And you could pick from countless stories in the Gospels where Jesus makes a distinct and deliberate connection with somebody who we might not look at and think, there's the face of God. And Jesus took time with them because he saw his own reflection in them. Mr. Rogers saw the face of Christ in every person, and especially in children. That's who he was primarily called to minister with. He often welcomed into his television neighborhood people who were different from himself in all kinds of ways. The cast and the crew and the guests on the program were diverse in countless ways. age, physical and mental ability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, educational level, socioeconomic status. Fred Rogers once said, I think everybody longs to be loved and longs to be known, to know that he or she is lovable. And consequently, the greatest thing we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. So here's the thing. 1 John, that teeny tiny epistle way back there in your New Testament, 1 John says that God is love. And if every person is made in the image of God, then every person is made in the image of love and has the capacity to love and to be loved. The behind-the-scenes crew that worked on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood looked nothing like Fred himself. Fred in his tidy suit and changing into his tidy sweater, straight-laced and clean-cut. And in the 1960s and 70s, many of the crew had long hair and tattoos. Unlike their boss's gentlemanly, mild manner, some of them were loud pranksters who did things like moon the camera when he wasn't around so that he would find it in the footage later on. But without exception, it seems that they genuinely loved him, felt respected by him, and he them. Fred Rogers' capacity to love in that way, to love even people who were so different from himself, is rooted in his theology, in how he knew and understood God. He never met a person who was not worthy of listening to, of spending time with, because he saw the face of God in each one. He never met a stranger, because he saw the face of God in every person. Once, an intern who was working on the television show traveled with Mr. Rogers to Boston. An influential executive from the Boston public television station had invited them over to his home for dinner with the rest of the man's family. The executive had arranged for a limousine to go and pick up Fred and his intern from the hotel. Well, once the limousine arrived at the executive's home, they were sitting out front, and the limousine driver asked Mr. Rogers when to pick him up. And Fred said it was going to be a couple of hours. And instead of sending the limousine driver off or telling him to just wait outside, Mr. Rogers invited him to just come on in for dinner. The wife of the television executive was quite taken aback by this and bewildered, but the limousine driver came to dinner. After dinner was over, Fred got in the front seat next to the limo driver, got to know him, and by the end of their chit-chat, well, the limo driver, whose name was Billy, ended up inviting Fred and the intern over to his home. So they went to Billy's house where Fred played the piano, and people from the neighborhood streamed in to the house to meet him and to listen. Fred and Billy stayed in touch. This wasn't just a one-moment thing. A few years later, Fred learned that Billy was in the hospital and was dying, and he called and talked to Billy on the phone to tell him how good it was to know him and to say goodbye. We would like to think, wouldn't we, that we have come a long way since the days of casting out a hemorrhaging woman, right? We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do that. We would like to think that we don't make or follow such archaic and divisive ways anymore. But who among us would even have a fleeting thought to invite someone to dinner who was on the other side of that glass partition in that limo. Whichever side of the glass you picture yourself on, right? Some of you readily picture yourselves as being the one who's being driven around, but others among us picture ourselves as the one doing the driving. And who on either side of that partition would jump to thinking, oh, well, I should invite him to dinner. He's a person. He's a child of God. Whether you picture yourself in Fred's position or Billy's position, we tend to see the boundary lines, the differences, and not notice that the other person reflects the face of God. A seminary student named Rebecca, who I just got to know in this past week, led a weekly Bible study for a group of people with disabilities at a ministry in North Carolina. Well, one day she was teaching the nativity story, and a middle-aged woman with Down syndrome who was a part of the group raised her hand with a question. Rebecca had previously heard the woman share stories about her being bullied back in high school. Mind you, she's middle-aged and she's still having to deal with the pain from being a young woman with Down syndrome in a high school. They were painful memories that had stuck with her for decades. And she asked Rebecca when she raised her hand, was baby Jesus born with Down syndrome too? And the room grew quiet as everyone awaited Rebecca's response. She answered as truthfully as she could, saying, I think baby Jesus may have had Downs because there is nothing that you have experienced, no trials, no suffering, that the Son of God has not known himself. Reflecting on this outside of the class setting, Rebecca said, the incarnation means that Jesus has solidarity with each of us, with those in wheelchairs and the blind and the intellectually challenged. She says, I know that the scriptures don't say that Jesus had Downs, but I think for this woman, he must have it. Friends, we see the face of God, the face of Jesus, in the person of every ability and disability, and in faces of every color, every creed, every age, every nation, every beautiful face and every disfigured face. Every face reflects the face of God. Sometimes it's hard to see because of where they've been in life and how they carry themselves, and when they're so different, perhaps from you. This thought echoes one of the early church fathers. In the 4th century, Gregory of Nazianzus explains it this way: that which Christ has not assumed, he has not healed. To flip that around, in other words, Christ has assumed all of it, all of us, all of what it means to live this human life. The face of God is in every person for whom God became incarnate, every person for whom he died on the cross and rose again so that we might also. Oh, that we would see the face of God in the woman with Down syndrome in North Carolina, in the woman who reached for Jesus' robe in the crowd, in the long-haired, tattooed TV crew member, in Billy, the limousine driver in Boston, in, you fill in the blank. In who? Who is it hard for you to look at and see the face of God? Who is it that you would really rather not look at all? Who is it in this world that you don't want to see? Because they too bear the image of the God who made them. How does this basic element of our Christian faith shape how you relate to others, or how you're called to relate to others? How does knowing that when you look at another person, any other person, you see the face of Christ, how does knowing that change how you live, or how you ought to live? May we live in such a way that it is evident in our words and our actions that we see the face of God in those around us. Amen.